First, on the same day that Bardia fell, Churchill took the decision that offensive operations in the Middle East were to be halted, the advance should not proceed beyond Benghazi, and the position there made secure. Then all military assistance should be rendered to Greece in their fight against the Italian invaders there. This was to be the military priority now. From his already stretched resources, Wavell was directed to prepare a sizable expeditionary force to Greece. Then, just over a month later, on February 2, 1941, Adolf Hitler wrote to Mussolini, expressing his concern about events in North Africa, and offering a German armored division to assist in the defense of Tripoli. Mussolini reluctantly accepted the assistance, and things moved quickly from here. On February 6, Adolf Hitler summoned one of his favorite generals to see him. After giving a detailed account of the situation in Africa, Hitler informed Erwin Rommel that Rommel had been recommended to him as the man who would most quickly adapt himself to the altogether different conditions of the African theater. Rommel was elated with his new appointment, and wrote to his wife, Lucy Maria, that evening, apologizing for cutting short his leave. "Things are moving fast," he informed her. "The new job is very big and important." Things were certainly moving fast. On February 11, Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel arrived in Rome to discuss military arrangements. Only 3 days later, the first German units arrived in Tripoli and were immediately dispatched to the front. They would eventually become the famous Deutsches Afrika Korps, DAK. The timing was crucial. Just as the British were winding down their operations and diverting their forces to meet other commitments, a new and formidable factor had entered the Desert War. It would soon be the British forces' turn to be surprised, and it began the period for them that David Fraser called the habit of defeat. On February 16, just 2 days after their arrival, the Germans were in action against the depleted British forces, and Rommel had taken command of the battlefront. At the end of March, despite the reluctance of his Italian allies, and in defiance of orders from the German Oberkommando des Heeres, Army High Command, Rommel launched a raid in force against the British positions in Libya. It turned into much more than that. Rommel wrote to his wife on April 3 that their attack had met with dazzling success, and that the British forces were falling over each other to get away. It was true. By April 10, the Axis forces had pushed the British back across the Egyptian border, leaving just the isolated Tobruk garrison holding out, now 80 miles behind the front line. By the end of April, the Axis was occupying all the old Italian positions along the frontier, and had established a forward outpost at Halfaya Pass, 10 miles inside Egypt. Axis casualties had been light, and 3 British generals, including the Army commander Richard O'Connor, had been captured. Rommel and the Axis had clearly won this round of the Benghazi Handicap, as the race across North Africa was now called. His success was as immensely satisfying to him as it was galling to his British opponents. He wrote to his wife that, "It's wonderful to have pulled this off against the British." But there was a tactical thorn that threatened to prick his growing reputation. The town of Tobruk and its wide defended perimeter held out against the Axis. It was defended largely by the 9th Australian Division, which was determined not to lose it. As Barry Pitt has written, Tobruk was to prove a continual distraction to Rommel's further ambition, and his attempts to storm its defenses were to cause him serious losses in both men and material during the months which followed. It would cause considerable losses for the British forces, too. While Tobruk was besieged, with its harbor providing a tenuous lifeline, 3 attempts were made by the British to drive the Axis forces back from the Libyan-Egyptian border and lift the siege. The British Army in these early years of the war was hampered by 2 serious flaws, both of them a legacy of the First World War. While the British Army had pioneered tank development in the 1914-18 war, it had then seriously neglected its development in the decades that followed. Tanks, many felt, were a marginal asset and were certainly unreliable. They were expensive and definitely not as likable as horses. So it was, then, that the British Army entered the Second World War without a coherent doctrine of armored operations, and with little general understanding of how those operations might change the whole pattern of warfare. It was a serious gap in the British Army's warfighting doctrine, one that would be responsible for several disasters ahead, and that would affect how the last Alamein battle would be fought. It was also the reason that the British failed to produce a quality tank during the war that could match those of the Germans. In response to the German challenge, we produce tanks with too thin a skin or too feeble a weapon, or both. It was not until mid-1942, during the Gazala battle, that the M3 Grant provided the British with a tank that could match the best of the German tanks. Later in the year, the British received an even better U.S.-designed M4 tank, the Sherman, which would eventually become the mainstay of British armored formations. The other flaw reflected the shadow of the barbed wire of the trenches of the Western Front. The defense, it was assumed, was the strongest and the wisest method of war. It also engendered, as the historian soldier David Fraser admitted, a spirit of caution and hesitancy that was never completely eradicated from all parts of the British command. But, as Fraser acknowledged, often bold offensive moves can lead to fewer casualties, when a cautious approach can accumulate many casualties for small gains. The first attempt to relieve Tobruk was the appropriately named Operation Brevity, launched on May 15. The offensive began well. The British forces achieved a tactical surprise and initially captured the key border locations of Halfaya Pass, Sollum, and Fort Capuzzo. But the offensive was brought to an abrupt halt when the Axis forces launched spirited counterattacks, and the British tanks encountered for the first time in this theater the powerfully effective 88mm anti-aircraft gun being used in an anti-tank role. The range and hitting power of this weapon was devastating on the lightly armored British tanks. The 88mm gun came to have an important effect on the morale of British armored formations from this time. It soon became the most feared weapon in North Africa. Curiously, the British had their equivalent of the 88mm in the 3.7-inch 94mm anti-aircraft gun, but hidebound British staff officers refused to allow it to be used in a dual role. One anti-aircraft gunner, Lieutenant David Perry, felt there was no excuse for the sheer stupidity of this decision. An 88mm gun had 3 times the effective range of a 2-pounder gun. Unfortunately, the 2-pounder gun was the standard armament of British tanks, and their anti-tank weaponry at this stage of the war. An 88mm gun could completely destroy a Crusader tank with one shot from a distance of 1.5 miles. With its range and sheer velocity, the 88mm gun wrought havoc on the North African battlefields and remained queen of the desert. After 10 days, and with the loss of 5 tanks and around 200 men, the offensive was called off. It was a humiliating defeat for the British 13 Corps. Rommel, who recaptured the last position lost to the British on May 27, recorded a succinct summary of the fighting. The British were soon driven out and fled in panic to the east, leaving considerable booty and material of all kinds in our hands. Our losses were comparatively insignificant.